On the afternoon of September 27, 1984, a man named Robert Hanley walked through the iron gates of the United States Embassy in Moscow, carrying a leather briefcase that contained nothing more suspicious than diplomatic correspondence and a copy of the Washington Post from 3 days earlier. He was 41 years old, married with 2 daughters back in Virginia, and had been working as a cultural attaché at the embassy since January of that year. His official responsibilities included coordinating art exhibitions, managing educational exchange programs, and facilitating visits by American musicians and theater companies to the Soviet Union. To anyone observing him, including the KGB surveillance teams that monitored every American diplomat in Moscow, as a matter of standard procedure, Robert Hanley appeared to be exactly what his credentials claimed: a mid-level State Department employee with no particular access to sensitive information and no apparent interest in anything beyond his narrow bureaucratic responsibilities. But Robert Hanley was not a cultural attaché. He was a deep cover officer with the Central Intelligence Agency, and he had been operating in Moscow under diplomatic cover for 9 months with a singular mission: to identify and recruit a source inside the highest levels of the Soviet government. The operation had been given the cryptonym Cardinal, and it represented one of the most ambitious and dangerous intelligence initiatives the CIA had undertaken since the height of the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s. The stakes were enormous. By 1984, the Soviet Union remained a formidable military power with thousands of nuclear weapons, a massive conventional army, and intelligence services that had penetrated Western governments at multiple levels. But there were signs, subtle indicators that analysts at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, had been tracking for several years, suggesting that the Soviet system was under strain. Economic growth had stagnated, consumer goods remained scarce, agricultural production consistently failed to meet targets, and within the Communist Party itself, there were rumors of ideological exhaustion, of a leadership class that no longer believed in the rhetoric it continued to repeat in public speeches and official pronouncements. The question that obsessed certain analysts and operations officers at Langley was whether these internal weaknesses could be exploited, whether it was possible to accelerate the decline of the Soviet system through strategic intelligence operations. And the consensus among those who advocated for such an approach was that the key lay not in sabotage or propaganda, but in obtaining detailed knowledge of the internal debates and power struggles within the Kremlin. If the CIA could place a source at the center of Soviet decision-making, someone with access to Politburo discussions, Central Committee memoranda, and the private assessments being prepared by military and intelligence officials, then the United States could anticipate Soviet moves, exploit divisions within the leadership, and potentially influence the trajectory of events in ways that would be impossible through conventional diplomacy or military posturing. Robert Hanley had been recruited by the CIA in 1976 while he was completing a doctoral degree in Russian literature at Georgetown University. He had spent 2 years studying in Leningrad during the early 1970s as part of a student exchange program, and his fluency in Russian, combined with his academic credentials and unremarkable personal background, made him an ideal candidate for long-term, deep cover work. After joining the agency, he had spent 5 years preparing for his assignment in Moscow. He studied Soviet bureaucratic culture, memorized the organizational structure of the Communist Party, learned the names and backgrounds of hundreds of mid-level officials, and underwent extensive training in surveillance detection, covert communication techniques, and operational security protocols. He was taught how to identify potential recruitment targets, how to assess vulnerability and motivation, how to establish trust without revealing his true affiliation, and how to manage the psychological pressures of living under constant surveillance in a hostile environment. His cover as a cultural attaché had been carefully constructed to provide both plausible access to Soviet citizens and a reasonable explanation for why he would be meeting with academics, artists, and intellectuals who might have connections to government officials. Cultural exchange programs required coordination with Soviet counterparts in the Ministry of Culture, which meant Hanley had legitimate reasons to attend receptions, conferences, and social gatherings where he could observe, listen, and gradually build relationships. But 9 months into his assignment, he had made no significant progress toward recruiting a source. The problem was not a lack of opportunities. He had met dozens of Soviet citizens who had access to interesting information, professors who consulted for government research institutes, journalists who covered party congresses, artists who received commissions from state cultural committees, but none of them had both the access and the motivation necessary for recruitment. Those with genuine access to sensitive information were typically true believers in the Soviet system or were so closely monitored that attempting to recruit them would have been suicidal. And those who expressed private doubts about the system rarely had access to anything beyond gossip and speculation. Then on the evening of September 27, 1984, Robert Hanley attended a reception at the House of Writers, a stolid building on Herzen Street where Soviet authors gathered for readings, lectures, and social events. The reception was organized to celebrate the publication of a collection of essays on contemporary Soviet theater, and Hanley had been invited because one of the contributors was a playwright whose work the embassy had supported for translation into English. The event was crowded, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap wine. Writers and critics stood in clusters, engaged in conversations that were simultaneously passionate and guarded, the kind of discussions where every sentence was calibrated to avoid saying anything that could be misinterpreted as ideological deviation. Hanley moved through the room slowly, nodding politely at acquaintances, making small talk about theatre productions and literary translations. He had learned to blend into these gatherings, to project an image of mild cultural enthusiasm without drawing attention to himself. He was standing near a table of wine bottles, refilling his glass, when a man approached and introduced himself as Viktor Sergeyevich Petrov. He was in his mid-50s, with thinning grey hair, thick glasses, and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time at a desk than in social situations. He spoke English with a heavy accent, but with surprising fluency, and he explained that he worked as a senior analyst at the Institute for USA and Canada Studies, a research organization affiliated with the Academy of Sciences that provided assessments and recommendations to the Central Committee on American Foreign Policy. They talked for 20 minutes about theater, literature, and the challenges of cultural exchange between nations with such different political systems. Victor was thoughtful, articulate, and occasionally ironic in ways that suggested he was not entirely satisfied with the official narratives he was expected to promote in his professional work. At one point, he made a comment about how difficult it was to write honest analysis when every conclusion had to conform to predetermined ideological frameworks, and Hanley recognized the remark as the kind of small signal that trained case officers learned to watch for, a subtle indication of internal conflict, of someone who had doubts but was too careful to express them openly. They exchanged pleasantries, and Victor mentioned that he would be interested in continuing the conversation sometime, perhaps over lunch, if Hanley ever wanted to discuss American literature or theater in more depth. Hanley agreed, keeping his tone casual, and they parted without making any specific plans. But that evening, back in his apartment in the embassy compound, Hanley wrote a detailed cable to headquarters describing the encounter and identifying Viktor Petrov as a potential target for assessment and possible recruitment. The cable was encrypted and transmitted through secure channels, and within 48 hours, analysts at Langley had compiled a comprehensive background file on Viktor Sergeyevich Petrov. The file revealed several facts that made Victor an extremely promising target. He had worked at the Institute for USA and Canada Studies since 1979 and his responsibilities included preparing assessments of American political developments, analyzing shifts in U.S. defense policy, and contributing to internal reports that were circulated among Central Committee members and senior officials in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He had access to classified materials, including transcripts of Politburo discussions and internal memoranda from the Ministry of Defense. His educational background was impressive. He had studied at Moscow State University, earned a doctorate in history, and spent 2 years in the late 1960s as a visiting scholar at Columbia University in New York. He was married with one adult son who worked as an engineer in Leningrad, and most intriguingly, there were indications in his personnel file that he had been passed over for promotion twice in the past 3 years, a pattern that suggested either political disfavor or ideological concerns about his reliability. Over the next 6 weeks, Robert Hanley worked carefully to build a relationship with Viktor Petrov without raising suspicion. They met for lunch on 3 occasions, always at locations that Viktor suggested. Once at a cafeteria near the Institute, once at a small restaurant on Arbet Street, and once at a tea room near Gorky Park. The conversations ranged across topics that seemed safely academic: comparisons between American and Soviet theater traditions, discussions of 19th-century Russian literature, debates about the role of culture in shaping political consciousness. But interwoven through these discussions were moments when Viktor revealed glimpses of his real thinking, moments when his carefully constructed professional persona slipped and something more honest emerged. During their 3rd meeting on November 9, 1984, Viktor made a comment that Hanley immediately recognized as significant. They were discussing the recent changes in Soviet leadership following the death of Yuri Andropov earlier that year and the selection of Konstantin Chernenko as General Secretary. Viktor had been talking about the challenges facing the Soviet Union, the need for economic reform, the inefficiencies of the centrally planned economy. And then he said something that cut through all the usual ideological qualifications. He said that the system was dying, that everyone who worked inside the government knew it was dying, but that no one had the courage to admit it publicly, because admitting it would mean acknowledging that decades of sacrifice and suffering had been based on a lie. Hanley listened without interrupting, watching Viktor's face as he spoke. The older man's expression was a mixture of bitterness and resignation, the look of someone who had spent years believing in something and had gradually, painfully, come to realize that his belief had been misplaced. And Hanley understood that this was the moment when the relationship could shift from casual acquaintance to something deeper, something operational. He responded carefully, expressing sympathy for the difficulties Viktor described, acknowledging the moral and intellectual burden of living inside a system that demanded conformity, while reality contradicted the official narrative. He did not push, did not make any explicit proposal. He simply created space for Viktor to continue talking, to reveal more of what he really thought. By the end of their conversation, Viktor had said enough that Hanley felt confident drafting a second cable to headquarters, recommending that the assessment phase be moved to active recruitment. The cable outlined the indicators suggesting that Viktor was vulnerable to recruitment: professional frustration, ideological disillusionment, access to valuable intelligence, and a personality profile that suggested he valued honesty and intellectual integrity more than personal security. The cable also noted the risks. Viktor worked in a sensitive position and was almost certainly subject to periodic security reviews. Any attempt to recruit him would need to be managed with extreme caution to avoid triggering KGB counterintelligence surveillance. The response from Langley came back within 72 hours. Hanley was authorized to proceed with recruitment, but he was instructed to follow a specific protocol designed to minimize risk. He was to arrange a meeting with Viktor at a secure location outside of Moscow, somewhere the KGB would be less likely to maintain active surveillance. He was to make the recruitment pitch directly and clearly, without ambiguity or deception, because any perceived dishonesty at that stage would destroy the possibility of building trust. And he was to provide Victor with a means of covert communication that would allow him to pass information without requiring face-to-face meetings, which would be too dangerous to sustain over time. On December 14, 1984, Robert Hanley invited Viktor Petrov to accompany him on a day trip to Zagorsk, a historic town approximately 70 kilometers northeast of Moscow. The trip was framed as a cultural excursion to visit the Trinity Lavra Monastery, one of the most important religious sites in Russia. Victor accepted the invitation, and they drove out of Moscow early on a Saturday morning in Hanley's personal vehicle, a battered Lada sedan that the embassy maintained for non-official travel. The drive took just over an hour, and they spent the first part of the journey making casual conversation about architecture and history. They arrived at the monastery around 10 in the morning and spent 2 hours walking through the grounds, observing the gilded domes and ancient frescoes, discussing the role of the Orthodox Church in Russian culture. The monastery complex was crowded with tourists and pilgrims, and Hanley used the crowd as cover, moving through the buildings and courtyards in a pattern designed to detect any surveillance. By noon, he was confident they were not being followed. They walked to a small park on the outskirts of the town, found a bench overlooking a frozen pond, and sat down. Hanley began the conversation by thanking Victor for his willingness to speak honestly during their previous meetings. He said that he had been moved by Victor's observations about the state of the Soviet system, that he recognized the moral courage it took to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. And then he said something that he knew would either solidify their relationship or destroy it permanently. He told Victor that he was not simply a cultural attaché, that he worked for the United States government in a capacity that involved intelligence collection, and that he believed Victor could play a critical role in helping to prevent the kind of catastrophic miscalculations that could lead to war between the superpowers. Victor did not respond immediately. He sat very still, staring at the frozen pond, his face unreadable. The silence stretched for what felt like several minutes, but was probably no more than 30 seconds. Then he asked a single question. What exactly did Hanley want from him? Hanley explained that the United States needed access to information about internal Soviet decision-making processes, about the debates happening inside the Politburo and Central Committee, about the assessments being prepared by military and intelligence officials. He said that this information would not be used to harm the Soviet people, but rather to help American policymakers understand Soviet intentions and avoid misunderstandings that could escalate into conflict. Victor asked how the information would be passed, and Hanley described a covert communication system that had been developed specifically for high-value sources operating in hostile environments. The system involved dead drops using locations that could be accessed without raising suspicion, encoded messages hidden in ordinary objects, and scheduled communication windows that would minimize the risk of detection. Hanley also explained that Victor would be compensated not with large sums of money that would be impossible to explain, but through deposits into a secure account that could be accessed after he left the Soviet Union, whenever that became possible. Victor asked one more question. Why should he trust that the United States would protect him if something went wrong? Hanley did not lie. He said that there were no guarantees that espionage was inherently dangerous, and that the KGB was highly professional and ruthless in its counterintelligence operations. But he also said that the CIA had a record of successfully exfiltrating high-value sources when operations were compromised, and that Victor would be provided with emergency communication protocols that could be used to request extraction if he felt his safety was at immediate risk. Victor stood up from the bench and walked a short distance away, his hands clasped behind his back, his breath visible in the cold air. Hanley remained seated, waiting, knowing that this was the moment when everything would be decided. After several minutes, Victor returned to the bench and said a single word in Russian. "Хорошо." Good. He said he would do it, not because he wanted to betray his country, but because he believed the Soviet system was already betraying itself, and that the suffering would only continue if nothing changed. They spent the next hour discussing operational details. Hanley provided Victor with a small, leather-bound notebook that appeared to be a journal, but contained instructions written in invisible ink that could be revealed using a specific chemical solution. The notebook included maps of dead drop locations in Moscow, a schedule of communication windows, and codes for signaling urgent messages. Hanley also gave Victor a Minox camera disguised as a cigarette lighter, small enough to be carried in a pocket without arousing suspicion, capable of photographing documents with sufficient resolution for intelligence analysis. They drove back to Moscow that afternoon, and Victor was dropped off at a metro station several blocks from his apartment. They did not speak during the drive, and they parted with a brief handshake and no indication that anything significant had occurred. But from that point forward, Viktor Sergeyevich Petrov, codenamed Cardinal, became one of the most valuable intelligence assets the CIA had ever recruited inside the Soviet government. Over the next 11 months, Victor provided a steady stream of classified documents and internal assessments that fundamentally altered American understanding of Soviet vulnerabilities. The first batch of material delivered through a dead drop in late December 1984 included copies of internal reports prepared for the Central Committee analyzing the economic crisis facing the Soviet Union. The reports were startlingly pessimistic, acknowledging that the command economy was fundamentally broken, that productivity had been declining for years, that consumer goods shortages were worsening, and that the government's attempts to address these problems through administrative reforms had failed completely. The second batch, delivered in February 1985, included transcripts of Politburo discussions about the war in Afghanistan. The transcripts revealed deep divisions within the leadership about whether to continue the military campaign or negotiate a withdrawal. Several Politburo members had argued forcefully that the war was unwinnable, that it was draining resources needed for domestic priorities, and that it was damaging the Soviet Union's international reputation. But the consensus had been to continue fighting because withdrawing would be interpreted as weakness and would undermine Soviet credibility with Allied governments. The third batch, delivered in April 1985, included assessments from the Ministry of Defense analyzing NATO military capabilities and Soviet strategic vulnerabilities. The documents acknowledged that the United States had achieved significant technological advantages in areas such as precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, and satellite reconnaissance, and that the Soviet military was struggling to keep pace. The assessments recommended massive investments in research and development, but also noted that such investments would be difficult to sustain given the dire state of the economy. Each delivery provided additional confirmation of what analysts at Langley had suspected but could never prove: that the Soviet system was under severe strain, that the leadership was aware of the problems but lacked the political will or institutional capacity to implement fundamental reforms, and that the facade of strength and confidence projected in public statements bore little resemblance to the internal reality. The intelligence from Cardinal allowed American policymakers to calibrate their strategies with unprecedented precision, to apply pressure in areas where the Soviets were weakest, and to avoid confrontations that might trigger desperate responses from a leadership that felt cornered. But the most significant intelligence Victor provided came in June 1985, shortly after Mikhail Gorbachev had been selected as General Secretary following the death of Konstantin Chernenko in March. Victor delivered copies of internal memoranda that Gorbachev had circulated among senior party officials outlining his vision for reform. The memoranda were remarkable in their candor. Gorbachev acknowledged that the Soviet system had failed to deliver on its promises, that the economy was stagnant, that corruption was pervasive, that the bureaucracy was ossified, and that fundamental changes were necessary to prevent complete collapse. He proposed a program of reforms that he called perestroika, restructuring, which would involve decentralizing economic decision-making, introducing elements of market competition, and allowing greater transparency in government operations. The memoranda also included Gorbachev's private assessment of the international situation. He argued that the Soviet Union could not sustain the arms race with the United States, that the military budget was consuming resources desperately needed for economic modernization, and that the only viable path forward was to pursue arms control agreements that would reduce tensions and allow the government to redirect spending toward civilian priorities. This assessment contradicted decades of Soviet policy and represented a fundamental shift in thinking at the highest levels of the Kremlin. The intelligence was transmitted to Washington and analyzed by senior officials at the CIA, the State Department, and the National Security Council. The consensus among these officials was that Gorbachev's reforms, if implemented, would create opportunities for the United States to accelerate the transformation of the Soviet system in ways that served American strategic interests. If Gorbachev was serious about arms control, then the United States could negotiate agreements that locked in American advantages while constraining Soviet military capabilities. If he was serious about economic reform, then the United States could offer conditional assistance that would encourage further liberalization. And if he was serious about transparency, then the United States could exploit the resulting openness to expose the failures and contradictions of the Soviet system to its own citizens. But the intelligence also included a warning. Victor had noted in his communications that Gorbachev faced significant opposition within the party from hardliners who viewed his reforms as dangerous deviations from communist orthodoxy. These hardliners controlled key institutions, including the military, the KGB, and large sections of the party apparatus. They were willing to tolerate limited reforms, but any attempt to fundamentally dismantle the command economy or reduce the party's monopoly on power would trigger fierce resistance. Gorbachev's position was precarious, and his ability to implement his vision depended on his skill in outmaneuvering his opponents while maintaining enough support within the broader party structure to prevent a coup. Throughout the summer and fall of 1985, Victor continued to provide regular updates on internal Kremlin dynamics. He reported on debates within the Politburo about the pace and scope of reforms, on tensions between Gorbachev and conservative ministers, on the growing anxiety among party officials who feared that loosening control would unleash forces that could not be contained. The intelligence was detailed, timely, and invaluable, but it also placed enormous pressure on Victor, who was living under constant fear of discovery. Every time he photographed documents, every time he visited a dead-drop location, every time he attended a meeting where classified information was discussed, he knew that a single mistake, a single moment of carelessness could lead to arrest, interrogation, and execution. In December 1985, Victor signaled through the covert communication system that he needed an urgent meeting with his handler. The signal indicated that something had changed, that he was facing immediate risk. Robert Hanley arranged a brief encounter at a bookshop on Kalinin Prospect, using a brush-pass technique where materials could be exchanged without any extended contact. They passed each other in an aisle, and Victor slipped a small envelope into Hanley's coat pocket before walking out of the shop without looking back. The envelope contained a handwritten note explaining that the KGB had recently initiated a security review of all personnel at the Institute for USA and Canada Studies. The review had been ordered by Yuri Andropov's successor as KGB chairman, and it was part of a broader effort to tighten internal security in response to concerns about Western intelligence penetration. Victor had been interviewed twice already, and while the questions had been routine, he was worried that the increased scrutiny would make it impossible to continue operating safely. He requested that the CIA consider suspending the operation temporarily until the security review was completed and the situation stabilized. Hanley transmitted Victor's concerns to headquarters, and the response came back within 24 hours. The decision was made to continue the operation but to implement additional security measures. Victor was instructed to reduce the frequency of his communications, to avoid photographing documents unless they were exceptionally valuable, and to rely more heavily on verbal reporting during brief encounters rather than physical dead drops. The rationale was that Victor's access to high-level intelligence about Gorbachev's reforms was too important to abandon, and that the risks, while real, were manageable if proper precautions were taken. Over the next 6 months, from January through June 1986, Victor provided sporadic but critically important intelligence. He reported that Gorbachev was moving forward with his reform agenda despite significant resistance, that he had replaced several conservative ministers with younger officials who supported his vision, and that he was preparing to announce a major policy initiative that he called Glasnost, openness, which would allow greater freedom of expression and criticism of government policies. Victor also reported that Gorbachev was deeply committed to achieving arms control agreements with the United States, and that he was willing to make significant concessions in order to reduce military spending and redirect resources toward economic modernization. But in July 1986, something went wrong. Victor failed to signal at a scheduled communication window, and he did not appear at any of the backup meeting locations. Days passed without any contact, and Hanley began to fear that Victor had been arrested. He drafted an urgent cable to headquarters requesting guidance on whether to attempt contact through emergency protocols. But before the cable could be transmitted, a different kind of message arrived. On July 23, 1986, a package was delivered to the United States Embassy through normal diplomatic mail channels. The package was addressed to the cultural attaché's office, and when it was opened, it contained a single photograph of Viktor Sergeyevich Petrov sitting in what appeared to be an interrogation room. He was wearing prison clothing, and his face showed signs of physical abuse. Attached to the photograph was a typewritten note in Russian stating that Soviet counterintelligence had identified and arrested an American spy operating inside the Institute for USA and Canada Studies, and that the traitor had confessed to providing classified information to the CIA for more than 18 months. The note included a list of the documents Victor had photographed and transmitted, along with dates and locations of dead drops and meetings. The detail was comprehensive and devastating, leaving no doubt that Victor had been thoroughly interrogated and that the entire operation had been compromised. The note concluded with a warning directed at American intelligence officers operating in Moscow, stating that further attempts at espionage would be met with the harshest possible consequences. Robert Hanley was recalled to Washington the following week and debriefed extensively about the Cardinal operation. The investigation into how the operation had been compromised took months and involved reviewing every aspect of the recruitment, the communication protocols, and the security procedures. The consensus among CIA counterintelligence specialists was that Victor had been betrayed by someone inside American intelligence who had provided information to the KGB. The investigation eventually focused on a CIA officer named Aldrich Ames, who was later arrested in 1994 and convicted of espionage. But at the time of Victor's arrest in 1986, Ames continued to operate undetected, and multiple intelligence operations were destroyed as a result of his betrayal. Viktor Sergeyevich Petrov was tried in a closed military tribunal in September 1986 and sentenced to death for treason. The sentence was carried out by firing squad on October 7, 1986, at a secure facility outside Moscow. His execution was not announced publicly, and his name was removed from official records. His wife was informed that he had died of a heart attack while traveling on government business, and his son was told nothing beyond the fact that his father was no longer alive. But the intelligence Victor provided during his 18 months as an active source had already achieved its purpose. The detailed information about internal Soviet vulnerabilities, about Gorbachev's reform agenda, about the economic crisis, and the military's strategic weaknesses had given American policymakers the knowledge they needed to shape their approach to the final phase of the Cold War. President Ronald Reagan and his advisors used the intelligence to calibrate their negotiations with Gorbachev, to apply pressure in areas where the Soviets were weakest, and to offer incentives in areas where cooperation served American interests. The arms control agreements that followed, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987, were shaped by the understanding that the Soviet Union could not sustain the arms race, and that Gorbachev was desperate for agreements that would allow him to reduce military spending. The intelligence also informed American decisions about how to respond to Gorbachev's domestic reforms, with the United States providing cautious support for perestroika and glasnost while avoiding actions that might strengthen the hardliners who opposed Gorbachev's policies. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, the role that Cardinal had played in accelerating that collapse was known only to a small number of officials within the CIA and the intelligence community. There was no public acknowledgement of Victor's contribution, no recognition of his sacrifice. His name remained classified, buried in operational files that would not be declassified for decades, and his family never learned the truth about how he had died or why. Robert Hanley left the CIA in 1989 and returned to academic life, teaching Russian history at a small college in New England. He never spoke publicly about his time in Moscow or about the agent he had recruited and lost. In private conversations with colleagues who had security clearances and knew about his past work, he occasionally reflected on the moral complexities of espionage, on the fact that recruiting sources meant convincing people to risk their lives for causes that might not directly benefit them, and on the knowledge that those people often paid the ultimate price for their cooperation. Years later, after the Cold War had ended and some operational files were declassified, historians and journalists began piecing together the story of intelligence operations that had contributed to the Soviet collapse. The name Viktor Sergeyevich Petrov appeared in some of these accounts, always in footnotes, always with limited detail. But those who studied the period understood that his decision to provide classified information to the CIA, despite the risks, had given American policymakers a window into the internal dynamics of the Kremlin at a critical moment in history, and that window had allowed them to act with confidence and precision in ways that helped shape the outcome of the Cold War. The story of Cardinal is not a story about heroism in any conventional sense. It is a story about choices made under impossible circumstances, about the human cost of espionage, and about the way that individual decisions, made in secret and at great personal risk, can influence events that shape the world for generations. Viktor Sergeyevich Petrov believed that the Soviet system was dying and that its death would bring suffering unless managed carefully. He chose to provide information to the United States not because he loved America or hated his own country, but because he believed that transparency and honesty were more important than loyalty to a system built on lies, and for that choice he lost everything.